Well, welcome to the round 3 of our class on Mora Nevuchim, on the Guide to the Perplexed. I was asked to announce that the miracle received, in other words, God listened. So that's certainly remarkable. But between you and I, what's the most remarkable thing about this day? If you'd ask me, the most remarkable thing is that the sun stood still. I mean, that's pretty freaking remarkable. So most commentaries, what the non-Maimonidean commentaries, which are most of the classical commentaries, understand these verses in a simple manner, in their simple meaning, that the sun actually did stand still, and that was the miracle. Now, there are a group of Maimonidean, heavily Maimonidean commentators who look at this verse and they have they're perplexed, right? How could this be? It just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And the most famous, or one of the most famous of the Maimonidean writers of commentaries, who was heavily influenced by the book we're studying together, is the Ralbag, right? So the Ralbag is also known as Gersonides, Rabbeinu Levi ben Gershom, who lived about 1.5 to 2 centuries after Maimonides. And the Ralbag looked at this and he says he had so many problems with this, and it's really long. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but his problems are, first of all, this would rank up there as the greatest miracle of all time. This should beat out even Moses' miracles of the Exodus from Egypt. I mean, this is pretty big, making the sun stand still. And he brings verses from all over that seem to indicate that Moses' miracles were the greatest in history. So why is this one just relegated to the book of Joshua in a few verses and written in such a cryptic way? And you think this is like the biggest miracle of history. And then again, we also have a rule, the Ralbag says, that God only does miracles that need to be done. And just if all it was is to win a battle, why did God need to make the sun stand still? What was the great ramifications of this? And the third question is what I pointed out in the beginning, is that from the last verse, it says there was never a day like this. And then it says, because God waged war for Israel. But the miracle that God did wasn't waging war, it was making the sun stand still. Well, based on those questions and a whole bunch of other questions where he goes through his understanding of the science of the sun and the moon and the stars, he writes as follows, and I'll just read the end. And this is just classic, because it's classic for what a Maimonidean philosopher would say. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily the right or wrong approach. I'm just saying this is the approach that Maimonides taught, and this is the approach that his followers did, including the Ralbag himself, which I'm about to read. So he says, like he writes as follows. The meaning of this verse, the haratzon v'zeh, the fact is that the battle was completed before the sun had a chance to completely set. It's not that the sun actually stood, but God waged war for Israel, and the war was so successful. And when Joshua was praying, he wasn't asking God to actually hold the sun up. He was praying because he was asking God, saying, we need it to remain day. We have to finish this war before the day is over, before the day ends. And God listened to Joshua in the sense that he allowed the people to be so victorious so rapidly that it was as if the sun stood still. And so this is the way, and he reads these verses, and that's how it would fit into that last verse, because God listened to man, which is an incredible thing, because Joshua prayed. God waged war. The miracle was in Ki Hashem nilcham Israel. It was God waging war for the people of Israel. So I just wanted to bring that up, and because it's a very, it's just a great example of how a rationalist interprets the verses and these kinds of things when struck with something that's very perplexing, versus other schools of thought in Judaism, mystical schools of thought, and so on. But I wanted to bring that out, and I want to therefore say, Maimonides is the primary thinker in Judaism who made this type of explanation, this type of thinking, this type of peirush mainstream, made it kosher, so to speak. That you can look at the verse and try to understand it in a philosophically more I guess rational way. Okay, so now I want to go on. We're about to do some now that I brought that example, I have to mention a little bit of Aristotle, because the Rambam isn't saying this, but what he's about to do is take Aristotelian philosophical categories and apply them to Torah categories. So Aristotle I'm not an Aristotelian expert, but I'm going to do my best at this. He is one of his most influential books, and I'm going to explain in a minute why. What some argue could have been his most influential work was his book on what we call today metaphysics. So basically, he divided between physics and metaphysics. And physics is the study of matter and energy and the rules and laws that make up, in his mind, the elements and so on, and the different qualities of the things that exist that we see in front of us. In other words, the equivalent of what we would call today physical science. Metaphysics to Aristotle is what we would today call, philosophical inquiry into the nature of being, right? The nature of what is and why it is, and the nature of what are the causes of things and what are the end results of things. And that's metaphysics. And this is really important because it's going to come up a lot in Aristotelian philosophy. When he searched metaphysics, when he contemplated and thought about those ideas of metaphysics, he concluded that there's everything in the world has a cause. Every cause has a cause, and at some point it has to end with a primary cause. There has to be some entity, some being that caused it all, right? And he called that the prime mover, which Maimonides identifies as God. Now, this prime mover in Aristotelian philosophy, because there has to be an ultimate cause, Aristotle argued that that ultimate cause, in other words, when you get all the way to that prime mover has to be the source of everything. He can't have another cause behind him that makes him happen, right? Otherwise it just keeps on going and going and going, which it doesn't make sense. So therefore, that ultimate cause has to be alone. That ultimate cause has to be the source of everything. So so the end of the book of Aristotle's metaphysics book is a proof that there is such an unmoved mover, which Maimonides, and he's going to say this clearly later, believes is identifies as what you and I would today call Hashem or God or whatever term works for you. So now the Rambam therefore also divides all of knowledge into these two categories, physics and metaphysics. Now I want to say that in a really fascinating turn of history, Aristotelian physics, in other words, his study of the world, the nature of matter and substance and so on, is, nowadays it doesn't really make much sense. And you can sit and read it and study it, but its influence on what we know today is minimal. We hardly know we understand the world, the elements and basic chemistry, basic biology. We understand them so differently than Aristotle that reading those books from how he understood the world is really useless. It's important for historical reasons, but that's it. However, the idea that Aristotle put out there of the unmoved mover, the prime cause behind everything, many historians of science understand that the idea that there is a central explanation for everything is what motivated and motivates to this day the entire scientific enterprise. Because the science, without having that idea that there is a system to it all, and that it all works and it operates in a singular way. And if we find out what people would now today call the grand unified theory, the basics of it all, science would never have been born. So it's fascinating that it's Aristotle's metaphysics which really gave birth to modern science, as opposed to Aristotle's physics, which is long fizzled out. And what the Rambam does, and this is what's incredibly powerful about the book that we're studying, is the Rambam says that he identifies that same idea as the God of the Torah. So the God of the Torah is the idea that there's an unmoved mover, there's a prime mover behind it all, and that there is a central direction, a central cause to everything that we see in front of us. So I want to put it out there, and now we can go on and read a little farther. So I'm gonna do a couple of things, and we're not going to cover a lot of ground in the Rambam today, but we will cover some. But I think some of these ideas are extremely important as we go through this book. So first of all, so we already explained this, where I'm starting from. We have already explained in our legal compilations. That's in the Pines translation. In our legal compilations, some general propositions concerning this subject, and have drawn attention to many themes. Thus, we have mentioned there, and I'm going to quote from what he means there, because some of the Rambam's other works is crucial for us to read before we move too much farther here, that the account of the beginning, which in Hebrew is Ma'aseh Bereishit, right, is identical with natural science. That's what Aristotle would. Does anyone have? If someone could say from the Friedlander translation, if someone could just unmute themselves and say exactly where we are in the Friedlander translation. If no one knows, then I'm going to open up a Friedlander myself and find it, but I don't have one in front of me.
You're not in Sefaria. You're asking about the Friedlander one?
Yeah. Well, Sefaria is actually the Friedlander. You can find in many formats, but in Sefaria is the Friedlander. So should I look on? It's hold on 1 minute.
Could you tell us where you are in the Shlomo Pines translation?
Yes, on page 6.
6.
The middle of the third chapter, the big chapter on the bottom.
Thus we have mentioned there that the account of the beginning
Yes.
is identical with natural science.
Right,
And
exactly.
the account of the chariot with divine science. And explain the rabbinical saying, the account of the chariot ought not to be taught even to one man, except to be wise and understood. Does that help those of you who are on Sefaria figure out?
It would be.
Chapter.
I'm gonna try to open the Sefaria in a minute.
It's in the introduction to the first part, and it's like the second or third page.
Yes, in the introduction, I'm getting the Sefaria open right now.
And I have 3b under this enumeration. 3b in the introduction.
Okay, so in the introduction on Sefaria, it reads as follows.
What is the numbers? Number what?
It's the
First
introduction to the first Chelek, the introduction to the first part, and it's not far in. It's know that also in natural science there are topics. It's the paragraph that starts that way. It's about in the Guide for the Perplexed introduction, prefatory remarks. That's how it's translated in Friedlander. So it's a paragraph that starts with those words. Know that also. Wait here. I'm.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, actually the paragraph is number 6. It's paragraph number 6, and the paragraph starts, I do not presume to think that this treatise settles every doubt in the minds of those who understand it. Okay, but if you go on in the middle of that one, you'll see some general principles bearing upon this point have been fully discussed in our works on the Talmud. That's from the Friedlander. Are people following me? And we have there called the attention of the reader to many themes of this kind. We also stated that the expression Ma'aseh Bereishit signifies natural science and Ma'aseh Merkavah, metaphysics. Okay, so here we have Maimonides is basically quoting Aristotle, and he's saying that in the Torah there's two categories of there's Ma'aseh Bereishit, which the Rambam directly identifies with Aristotle's physics, and Ma'aseh Merkavah, which he directly identifies as Aristotle's metaphysics. And we explained the force of the rabbinical dictum that the Ma'aseh Merkavah, meaning metaphysics, must not be fully expounded, even in the presence of a single student, unless he be wise and able to reason for himself. And even then, and I'm going to go back on this in a minute and explain it in more modern terms that we'll understand and be able to relate to. You should merely acquaint him with the heads of the different sections of the subject. You must. So the Rambam says that the rabbis had said we shouldn't teach this Ma'aseh Bereishit and Ma'aseh Merkavah in public, and therefore, as I am teaching this to you, I'm just going to drop ideas, heads of sections. I'm not going to go into the deepest depths of everything. Now, before we understand, this, we have to go to some of the places where the Rambam mentioned. He said, I've already discussed this on my works on the Talmud. So I want to go to those works and I want to read to you what he says. And I want to divide a little bit more as to what he means by things that you can't, why the Rambam says we can't teach these things in public and what he's afraid of. So we're going to go into that. Okay. So first of all, I want to I'm trying to think where I should start. Okay, so if in section 2, okay, no, here's what I'm going to do. The Rambam's the main place where he discusses this is in his Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah. You won't have this in front of you. In his commentary on the Mishnah, which is the Mishnah in Chagiga, which those of us that are doing the daily Daf Yomi will get to in about a month or two from now. And the Mishnah in Chagiga, the second chapter, the first Mishnah, is where the rabbis say that you shouldn't teach Ma'aseh Bereishit, which the Rambam interprets as physical science in groups of and larger groups, and you shouldn't teach the Ma'aseh Merkavah, which the Rambam identifies as metaphysics, biyachid, even to a single person. So the Rambam there identifies these two. He identifies, like we said, Ma'aseh Bereishit. He on his explanation of that Mishnah, he starts to explain what exactly it is that they were worried about. And here, give me 1 second. I want to try to paraphrase this in a good way. I'm trying to think of this. Give me a second. Basically, what the Rambam says as follows. I'm going to paraphrase it on my own. And this is what he explains on his explanation of that Mishnah. It was what he was just referring to, and he said, I already explained. So I'm telling you what he already explained. And that is as follows. If a person does not have a good handle on science, physical science, right? Then when they read Bereishit, now in the Rambam's mind, right, Bereishit is science. And he's going to explain throughout this book how the science that he understood, which is the science of Aristotle, fits with Bereishit, okay? Similar to someone who were to learn Bereishit today and say, I see evolution there, or something that we know today from modern science, or I see certain concepts of biology or geology there in Bereishit. The Rambam saw Aristotle's science in Bereishit. So the Rambam says, if a person doesn't know science and he reads Bereishit and he thinks that the words in this text are the truth, he can come to many, many, many mistakes, right? He can look at the words and conclude that the Torah doesn't know what it's talking about, right? Or he can look at the words and conclude certain big mistakes about theological mistakes, such as he might think that God always, he might think of God as a being who speaks. He might think of God as a being who blows air. You might think of God as So if you don't understand that Ma'aseh Bereishit is written in parables, right, then you could come to many, many, many mistakes. So number one, the Rambam says you have to actually know science. So if you don't know, which is why he says you shouldn't teach Ma'aseh Bereishit to someone who's uneducated, because if you do, they're going to read through the book and they'll be led to many, many mistakes. Does that make sense? Okay. If anyone, and the Rambam explains that in his Pirush Mishnayot, and for those that want to look it up, it's in Masechet Chagiga, chapter 2, Mishnah Aleph, the first Mishnah in chapter 2 of Chagiga. So that was what the Rambam was referring to when he says. But now I want to bring something else. So if we move in Moreh Nevuchim, if you can go to the part 2 of Moreh Nevuchim, chapter 29. It's actually a wonderfully beautiful chapter. But in part 2, chapter 29, the Rambam also goes directly into this idea of Ma'aseh Bereishit not being literal, and he takes it to its very he takes a little bit deeper than he does here, and basically he explains that that if people, he criticizes preachers. Someone else mentioned last time, preachers who take the literal word of the law and then they say this is what it means. So if they preach Bereishit and they say that it means exactly what it says, right? I want to read his language. He says, I'm trying to find a word here. Give me 1 second. That it could come to it could lead to incredible. I want to find, because he uses one of his not like some of those preachers and commentators that are stupid. Miskeinim, if you know the Hebrew word miskein, it's almost a bad word. Shehem medamim, that they think that ki yediat perish hamilim, that knowing what the words mean, that's wisdom. So if they could translate the words of Bereishit of Genesis, then now they know the truth about how the world is created. So, and because they in the end, when they keep speaking like this, they create confusion among people, and they bring about both heresies, heretical ideas about God, and they bring about people that see when they read the Torah and they think this is science, it doesn't fit with what they know to be true. But here's what's really amazing, and Rabbi Kapach, who was the translation that I'm using in Hebrew, he points out that, and this is the main point that I really want you to get from this, is that even though the Rambam will do this on many occasions, he will say that when Bereishit says X, Y, Z, it says something, certain words, and then they don't make scientific sense on the surface. He then goes ahead and explains these words really mean, right? And then he'll explain why they really mean, and then he's going to fill in an Aristotelian concept, right? Which doesn't work with you and what you and I understand science to be, right? So when he talks about the motions of the heavens, the Rambam understood them as there were spheres surrounding that go around the earth and so on. These are ideas that we now know post-Galileo not to be true anymore. But Rabbi Kapach points out that Maimonides understood that, which is what he knew, that even though the Rambam thought that Aristotelian science was 100%, right? He didn't know that one day it's going to all go out the window. So he therefore emphasizes that I'm not going to explain everything, because the words of the Torah are parables. So when you learn your science and when you look at the Torah, you might start to see something else that I didn't see. You might start to explain and say, you know what, just because the Rambam thought, just because I myself, I'm talking as if I was the Rambam, thought that this verse meant A, somebody 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now might think it means B. But because the words aren't meant to be literal, we now have the ability to do that, right? If the words were literal, right, and they meant exactly what they said, and Bereishit wasn't written in parables, then we'd be stuck, right? We'd be stuck with one explanation, and this is the only thing that could be true. But because it's not written literally, this can change over time. when we learn more things about the world and we see certain things, you can look back at Bereishit and say, well, this makes sense. So as long as you understand that, then it's okay to look at Bereishit and, for example, say what a lot of people would say, well, this looks a lot like evolution. I mean, it starts off with creation of more simple creatures, and then it kind of works its way up to more complex creatures, and eventually a human being is created. That kind of fits. So that's fine, right? As long as you know and understand that if 100 years from now, there's a more advanced understanding of how nature works, then you can look back in the Torah and say, but the key thing is that Ma'aseh Bereishit is stating that God created a world that is based on rules of science. And that's what the Rambam is trying to tell us here. And I'm going to open the floor for comments, questions, because this is a crucial idea to understand. So the Rambam is showing us how to interpret these psukim, and then he will give us suggestions of interpretations, but he leaves it open for us to change those interpretations, because he doesn't say everything. Remember the last words he just said, it was that I'm not going to tell you everything, because if I do, it's going to lead to dumb mistakes. All right, I'm going to hold for now, and let's take some questions from people or comments. If there isn't, I'll just move on.
You spoke about the Torah speaking in parables, but exactly, can you give a specific example of what Maimonides would have interpreted as a parable? I mean, for a parable is a story with a message or a moral at the end of it. Are you using parable in that sense, or parable in a different?
Sometimes I'm more using it in the sense of meaning that the literal translation of the words is not really the message or the meaning of the words. In other words, the message is behind those words. But that's what it means, because he uses the language mishalim, which here is referring to, it's not so, sometimes it does means like a moral message like that. But here it's talking about the literal, so for example, just a simple example, when it says Vayipach ba'apav nishmas ruach chaim, that God breathed the breath of life into Adam's nose and breathed life into him. So on a simple level, one would imagine that God was a being who breathes, right? And he came down to this, and he took a blow, right? And he blew in his nose. But obviously, the Rambam is, and many people would have interpreted it that way. The Rambam is saying, no, it's meant as we want to understand the lesson behind that God gave life, and breath signifies life, and so on. I mean, you can go on and on, but it doesn't mean that God actually blew into anyone's nose, right? So that would be what just a simple example. Any other comments? I want to know if people want, if I hope what I said makes sense.
Have you, yes, it does make sense so far. Can you explain what the account of the chariot, what Ma'aseh Merkavah is? I may have missed it.
So Ma'aseh Merkavah, well, actually, this would be good to read from the Rambam himself in the Pirush Mishnayot, which he told us we should remember, right? So now we're remembering it. So this is how he explains Ma'aseh Merkavah here. Ma'aseh Merkavah is knowledge, Mada Eloki, which means godly knowledge. Vuhu hadavor, which is what refers to existence, klalut hametziut, and the existence of God, God's knowledge, so to speak, describing God, the necessity of God for there to be an existence, right? The ideas of angels, the soul. Reading the Rambam's own words, the knowledge that we have, the consciousness of a human being, things about like what happens after death, right? In other words, does our consciousness still exist after death? So that's the Rambam's own words describing Ma'aseh Merkavah. Are we good? So that's why I made sure I mentioned this, because it's important, because the Rambam here says I already talked about it, so we're supposed to already know.
Yeah, so can I ask you one that was written by Maimonides?
Yeah, I just read Maimonides' own words.
Now, am I missing something? He says it ought not to be taught even to one man. Well, why is he writing it if it's not to be taught even to one man?
this is this is the irony of this book. It's almost like the Rambam is joking, because he constantly tells you that he's not going to say this and he's not going to write it, and then he writes it, which is why it's a lot of scholars believe that the Rambam was kind of, protecting himself from criticism of people saying, the Mishnah says you're not supposed to teach it, right? There's a place, it slips my mind. I remember where we're gonna, actually, it's in the Rambam later. I can't remember what chapter. It's in the Guide to the Perplexed, where he touches upon this. He says, I also have an obligation to teach. I mean, the Torah says that when you know truth, you're supposed to teach it, right? But meanwhile, it says here that you're not supposed to teach. So his answer is to be somewhere in between, to drop little hints, but the truth is that because of what I was saying before about how modern science has changed and our understandings of things have changed and so on, it makes it ingenious because it means that the Rambam gives us ideas and he gives us approaches, but he doesn't tell us exactly what everything is, because he recognizes and understands that could change. I'm going to continue. You know what I'll do is, just for the sake of those that are following in the Friedlander on Sefaria, I'll read from there rather than read from the Pines. Even though I like the Pines better, but I'll do this because that's what more people have. So I'm still in paragraph number 6 in the Guide for the Perplexed, Introduction, Prefatory Remarks. So the Ma'aseh Merkavah must not be fully, I think I read that, must not be fully expounded even in the presence of a single student, unless he be wise and able to reason for himself. So I want to, so people, we now understand why the Rambam is so worried that people that are not intelligent and not educated could make very serious mistakes. You must therefore not expect from me and even then you should merely acquaint him with the heads of the different sections of the subject. You must therefore not expect from me more than such heads. I'm only going to drop little topics and ideas. And even these have not been methodically and systematically arranged in this work. He did not want it to seem like this is the be all and end all. This explains the Torah, okay? That's not how the Rambam wanted it. He wanted it scattered all over the place, but have been, on the contrary, scattered and are interspersed with other topics, which we shall have occasion to explain, so that the experience of reading this book opens your mind and gives you ways and paths of understanding. That's the guide for the perplexed. You're perplexed, he's giving you these ways to understand. My object in adopting this arrangement is that the truth should be at one time apparent and at another time concealed, right? So as you read through this book, sometimes you'll understand, but then you'll be confused, right? And then you keep reading and then you'll understand a little, and then you'll still be confused, and then you'll understand, and so on and so forth. Thus, we shall not be in opposition to the divine will. The Rambam is playing with this problem. I want to teach you, right? But I need to keep what the Torah told, the rabbis told me I'm not supposed to teach you. So what am I going to do? I'm not breaking the rules because I'm not really teaching you, but I am. So thus we shall not be in opposition to the divine will, from which it is wrong to deviate, which has withheld from the multitude the truths required for the knowledge of God, according to the words, the secret of the Lord is with them that fear him. The key being that you need to know that. So now the Rambam is going to go on to another idea, and I think we'll cover this idea. I'm now about to read paragraph 7. Know that also in natural science, so not only in the Ma'aseh Merkavah, in the spiritual sciences, right, are there very difficult ideas, but also in natural, just plain old natural science, there are topics which are not to be fully explained. As our sages laid down, the rule of the Ma'aseh Bereishit must not be expounded in the presence of two. Why? If an author were to explain these principles in writing, it would be equal to expounding them unto thousands of men. So therefore, I can't really write a book of science, which, by the way, the Rambam wrote many books on science, just to put that out there. He wrote numerous books on medicine, especially. But for this reason, the prophets treat these subjects in figures, and our sages, imitating the method of scripture, speak of them in metaphors and allegories. This is so important that the Rambam repeats over and over again that Chazal, that the rabbis throughout the Talmud and the Mishnah and Medrash were always writing in metaphors and allegories, because there is a close affinity between these subjects and metaphysics, and indeed they form part of its mysteries. In other words, so the rabbis themselves, when they taught us messages, took that same pattern that the scripture does. And therefore, a lot of what they wrote is metaphors and allegories. Do not imagine that these most difficult problems can be thoroughly understood by any one of us. No one person, and the Rambam is including himself, can understand or know the answer to everything. So there will be cases where the Rambam himself will give us ideas, and then he'll say, but this I don't have an answer for. That's for you. Maybe some of us learning might find the answer, maybe not. Because this is not the case. No one person can know everything. At times, the truth shines so brilliantly that we perceive it as clear as day. These are moments of inspiration. And I really want you to listen to it, because we're about to say something it's incredible and very exciting. So our nature and habit then draw a veil over our perception. We know it, and then all of a sudden we lose a handle on the truth, and we return to a darkness almost as dense as before. We are like those who, although beholding frequent flashes of lightning, still find themselves in the thickest darkness of the night. It's dark, you can't see anything, and then a flash of lightning, you see it. On some, the lightning flashes in rapid succession. Some of us have a very incredible clarity of thought that we very often see things and know things, and they seem to be in continuous light, and their night is as clear as the day. This was and here the Rambam is going to give us a hint to his understanding of what prophecy means. And I'm going to say this right now. The Rambam believes that prophecy is that knowledge that we have when we really know something. That is when a prophet sees something with credible clarity, that is what prophecy is. And the greatest prophet of all, this was the degree of prophetic excellence attained by Moses, who was the greatest of prophets, to whom God said, but as for thee, stand thou here by me, right? And of whom it is written, the skin of his face shone, etc. Right? Because Moses was constantly in that state of knowledge, and therefore he was the greatest prophet. But by others, only once during the whole night, it's a flash of lightning. You can go your whole life, in one moment, you have a prophecy. So the Rambam over here I think this is a good place to stop, but he just gave an extremely scientifically understandable and an experiential thing that we all have on what prophecy is and what prophecy means. Very, very different than what many of us thought prophecy was. About thinking of a God or an angel of God coming and talking to you. Well, it is still that, of course, it's still God talking, but it's an experience that we can all relate to. And when the Rambam describes prophecy, he's going to go into it in detail, but he just touched on it now. The reason why he touched on it now is to tell us, right, that this is what the experience of reading this book is going to be like. I'm going to drop truths, and you're going to understand them, and then you're going to get confused again. I'm going to drop another truth, and you'll understand it, and then you'll get confused again, and so on and so forth. That's what the experience of reading this book is going to be like. So now I'm going to open the floor to anyone who wants to share any thoughts, because I think this is a good stopping point.
You alluded earlier to what was it?
Yeah.
Come back to me later. Organize my thoughts.
Anyone else have something they want to contribute or say or ask?
I'd like to throw something out there. Do you think that Maimonides believed that in the truth or a truth? Does he think that the Torah meets you where you are? Or that it has a specific meaning?
I think Maimonides believed that there was the truth. Because he's very adamant. I mean, I think he thinks that there, well, the one thing is true, and that's God. That's the one thing that Rambam is very consistent about. So that it all ends in the unmoved mover of Aristotle. Yeah. Everything, a lot of other things he left out. It's clear that he understood that his explanations of what certain verses mean are not the be all and end all, and that other people could come up with new explanations later. But so those ideas, I think but when it comes to the truth, the single truth that explains everything, the Rambam believed, as Aristotle believed, that that's just the way it is, that there is a God. So I think that's probably the best answer to that.
Thank you.
Okay, you alluded earlier to the there were post-Maimonidean scholars or rabbis that
Right.
adhered to his philosophy. Are there any modern Maimonidean
Well,
scholars?
there's a lot of people today that Maimonides is among especially among more intellectually inclined, and would speak within within all branches of Judaism. There's a lot of people. The Rambam gives us the ability to remain this, and through works like this book, to remain devoutly religious, but still make sense of the world in a scientific way. I mean, it's an ongoing process. So among the Orthodox world, it's certainly the minority in terms of numbers, but there are plenty of scholars out there that you have to use the Rambam in order to stay religious and scientifically, philosophically stable. There's a lot of writers out there. There's one who I would highly recommend if you want to read his books. His name is Menachem Kellner, Kellner. He wrote numerous books, and his articles you can find online. And he's one of the, I don't know if there's a ranking of top Maimonidean scholars today, but if there was a ranking, he'd definitely be near the top of the list, if not at the top of the list. And he writes beautifully. And I have a book of his that just came out in July. It's called We Are Not Alone. It's a small book, but it was this is some of his books are a little bit more scholarly and not kind of directed at the general audience, but this one was directly demonstrating how necessary it is for a person who's Orthodox, who's Jewish, who believes in Judaism, how Maimonides helps you remain faithful in today's world, today's science, with today's ethics, today's morals. Because the Rambam's ethics and morals were not the same as ours either. I mean, to him, it was fine to not have equality between men and women, right? But one of this book called We Are Not Alone is he deals with these questions, how even though Maimonides may not have necessarily had the same exact ethics as we do today, but his principles and ideas, if they're applied, can very much inform us today. So I'd recommend reading his books because he has some really, really good. Another one was called something like Maimonides' Encounter with Mysticism, which it's a big fat book and there's a lot in there, but it talks about the difference in how a Maimonidean interprets the Torah and religion, and how a non-Maimonidean, a non-rationalist, does the same thing.
Would you say that there are modern day Orthodox Jewish scientists that would adhere to Maimonidean?
Very, very much so. And you'll hear that's why a lot of the schools that, the famous Maimonides school in Boston, the high school was given that name because they wanted to embody this idea, the idea that we can reconcile the two, not just reconcile, but they live together nicely. I'll say that I read to you the Rambam, it's not just that the Rambam happens to say that Bereishit is not meant literally. It's the yesod, it's the basic building block of this entire book, and it's going to come up on almost every single page. This is the basic building block. I have had conversations. There's one particular one, I'm not going to say with whom it was, but a very prominent ultra-Orthodox rabbi who literally told me that it's not true. The Rambam doesn't say that Bereishit isn't literal. And I showed him, some of the pieces that I read to you tonight. And he starts explaining, no, that's not what it means. It means something else. And it's like, so, and then, but after a while, I realized, it was a completely and utterly useless conversation, because it's okay to say, I don't like the Rambam's approach and I want to take some of the other philosophers' approach. That's fine. I'm totally cool with that. Mm-hmm. But when people completely deny that the Rambam said what he said and try to make it out as if it's not a valid approach to Judaism, is completely and utterly intellectually dishonest. The idea that, so when you have an argument with somebody who's a biblical literalist and you try to say Maimonides says otherwise, and they claim at you that Maimonides didn't say otherwise, they're just, I don't even know how to start such a conversation. Probably better not to.
a different teacher has said that there are different levels of interpretation of the Torah,
Mhm.
doing with the plain literal meaning, and then going up in levels to more and more esoteric or
Right.
related from the concrete text.
Yeah.
So would you say Maimonides' interpretation of Genesis?
Maimonides' interpretation of what plain literal meaning is different than someone else's plain literal meaning. The Maimonides thinks that the plain literal meaning is to be interpreted in what he calls Mishal, right?
Okay. So it's
And his arguments are going to be solid because when he starts analyzing the words of the verse, he's going to show you, it says God has an outstretched arm, right? All of us look at it and know right away that clearly God doesn't have an arm and he didn't stretch his arm out. It's obvious that what it means is that God did something to help save us, in the same like a human being stretches their arm out when a person's, God forbid, drowning in the water, and you grab a person, you pull him in. That's the image being used. But obviously, because that's how human beings have that mental image, and it helps portray that God reached out to us, and quotation marks, out to us when we were suffering and took us out of Egypt, right? So that's fine. But so the Rambam says, why is it okay over there that everyone understands that it's not literal, but then other verses people look at and they think it's literal? Clearly, the Torah, and he's going to go through so many examples. In that very chapter 2:29, Maimonides basically covers the entire book of Isaiah in that chapter. And Isaiah uses all these beautiful metaphors about the skies and the suns and the heavens and the stars, and the world's going to shake, and trees and mountains and rivers, and the Rambam points out, obviously Isaiah doesn't mean that the mountains are going to do this and the trees are going to do that. He's using this imagery in order to portray the point that he's trying to make. The famous one, the Isaiah's famous one, the lion will sit with the lamb, right? Do we really think that a lion's going to sit next to a lamb? I mean, obviously, what it means is that maybe if he's eating it, but Isaiah uses those metaphors because they mean something to us, and it's obvious to most people. They mean that people will stop preying on each other, will stop fighting with each other. There's going to be world peace, right? So Maimonides says, why is it okay that over there we understand that it's a metaphor, but then when we read that and when we count out that the world is 6,000 years old based on calculating the exact numbers in Bereishit, that's not a metaphor. Rambam says, no, clearly that's also a metaphor, and it's meant to be interpreted that way. When the Torah says there was a day and then another day and another day, it doesn't mean a 24-hour period, on the clock like you and I have today. Now, exactly what it does mean, that could change because we have different understandings. Now we think the world is 15 billion years old, let's say. I don't know. If I get this wrong, correct me. Maybe someone will discover that the world is 30 billion years old. I don't know. Maybe physics, their knowledge advances, right? But the bottom line is the Rambam allows us to read Bereishit and then say, okay, well, it means that God created the world and he did by these rules, Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm going on, but any other comments?
So
Yes, go ahead.
I just have a relatively simple question. I think would Rambam define prophecy as like a moment of epiphany? Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's a good word. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, that's exactly the moment when you see it, you got it. It works. It makes sense. That is prophecy. And that's what the Rambam just said. He's going to go into prophecy in a lot more detail. Right now, he's just touching on it because he wants us to get a feel for how the book is going to go, right? But yes, that's very good. Yeah, I like that. Thanks. Any other anyone want to ask, say? No. All right. Well, if that's the case, then we'll call it a night, and we'll continue from here. And hopefully we'll
maybe I'll ask one question, Renzo.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just struggling with the thought that like there are multiple levels of understanding, and who's to choose which one is the correct one? For the person who wants to think that there's a literal arm that's stretching out and it does it for them, knock yourself out. all power to you. For someone who wants to see it more, but why would you, so who's to decide which interpretations of the multiple levels of truth,
So
or actually the single truth through different lenses? Maybe that's the way of seeing it. But
Yeah.
it sounds like he's weighing in on like, no, not that one. It must be this one.
I think you're right. I think you're making a good point. Some of the later scholars criticized Rambam. Most famous, I mean, the Ravid criticized Rambam and said that just like you said, if someone wants to think that God has an arm and stretches it out, so all right, so he thinks that, you don't have to call him a heretic. You don't have to call him a stupid ignoramus like the Rambam did. He's whatever. He's a simple guy. That's what he thinks because that's what he reads, right? So the Ravid criticized the Rambam for that. That's one famous thing. And another one is that Gersonides, who is the word who I quoted in the beginning, his Maimonidean style interpretation of those verses in Joshua, although he's very much a Maimonidean in his philosophy, he was famous for criticizing Maimonides because he says when Maimonides interpreted Bereishit with Aristotelian ideas, Maimonides was making a mistake because he was making the same mistake that Maimonides doesn't want us to make, right? By claiming that this is the meaning of the verse. What happens later on when you don't like Aristotle anymore, and now you find another meaning? So he didn't like the fact that the Rambam said this is the meaning, right? Because he was so it's almost like using Maimonides' concerns against Maimonides himself. But the Gersonides wrote a famous work of philosophy called Milchamot Hashem, the Wars of God, and part of that is he criticized Maimonides, but he's also very much Maimonidean. Anyway, I'm sorry. Any other comments before we close?
No, I'll just add. Thank you for that. But two quick comments.
Sure.
One is Torah Umada. Would you say that that sort of encapsulates the Rambam's philosophical outlook? And then before you answer that, the one person I can think of in modern times, unfortunately, he died very young, was Aryeh Kaplan. He to my mind, he does a phenomenal job. And personally, I got tremendous inspiration as a young person reading the stuff he wrote about trying to reconcile science and religion, and so that would be a suggestion to other people if you haven't read Aryeh Kaplan.
Yeah, first of all,
Torah Mada, what's your answer to that? Is that kind of the encapsulation?
Torah Mada means a lot of things, but definitely Maimonidean philosophy is one of the underpinnings. The famous book that Rabbi Lamb, who passed away recently, wrote, Torah Mada. It's in English. If anyone wants to get it, it's by Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, who was the president of Yeshiva University in New York for a long time. But Torah Mada is the topic is in that book. He discusses the philosophy and the different ways, the different underpinnings in Jewish theology that can support the idea that Torah and science can coexist. And Maimonides is really one of the key ways of doing that. It's not the only way. There's other ways to make Torah and science coexist. But the Rambam, and I think I saw a comment from Billy before that this sounds like the reconciliation, and it is. And this is Maimonides' way of reconciling the two. But yeah, and the other comment you mentioned, Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, and it's clear that you and I grew up on the the left edge of orthodoxy, where we were struggling with these things as teenagers, and the Aryeh Kaplan books made their way into my library as well. And I'll never forget when Aryeh Kaplan discusses the question of evolution versus versus the Torah's account, and he talks about the cognitive dissonance that the Rambam mentioned, right? The cognitive dissonance between someone who goes to work every day and he's a biologist, and the basic foundation of his work is evolutionary science, but then he goes home and he reads Bereishit and he claims that it's all a bunch of baloney and the Torah is the truth and God created the world in 6 days and so on. And he said this kind of Aryeh Kaplan was one of the also my influences on my life in those days. And I was in high school, of saying that you can't live with that cognitive dissonance. You may or may not have an easy answer, but to walk through life, davening in shul and thinking one thing, and then going to work and being a doctor, a lawyer, or whatever it is that you do that's based on something non-Torah based, and having that cognitive dissonance is unacceptable. And Ari Kaplan does make some suggestions that he writes a lot about this subject. So yeah, I appreciate that you brought it up, because yeah, people can definitely look for his books. They should be pretty easily available. But yeah, and anyone else want to share anything? If the answer is no, then we'll call it a day, and looking forward to next week when we'll continue. Okay. All right. Be well. Have a wonderful
Thank you
evening.
so much. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.